Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the My Family Thinks I'm Crazy podcast. I'm rolling solo again. Jay is away, working for the man. But my co-host is not here, but we have an awesome guest. His name is Matt McCusker. You know him from Matt and Shane's Secret podcast. You also know him from a book he just came out with, right?
That
Overlook.
was a couple of years ago, but yeah,
Couple years ago.
relatively
Okay.
recently. Yeah.
And are you working on anything else as far as authorship?
Yeah, I wrote I think it was like an 80, 90 page book that I do another thing, Romas, which is with my friend Wes, and it's kind of like a self-development kind of thing. So I wrote like an 80 page book. That's going to be we're going to build like a little Romas University thing. So that's on there in audio form. But right now I'm writing, I have another novel I started, and I'm taking a break from that to write two short stories that shortish, but I'm going to write two short stories that are each about probably 50 to 60 pages. So it'll be like a kind of two stories, but like a novel length.
Excellent. Yeah, I'm looking forward to that, man. You're such a deep guy. I think, your comedy podcast doesn't always show that kind of depth. Where did this journey begin for you? You're obviously a very hilarious person. You and Shane touch on so many topics that most comedians are too afraid to even think about.
Mm.
Where did this begin for you? Were you naturally inquisitive child? Were you always questioning the narrative, like in the mainstream, or how did this start for
I don't know. I don't think I really cared about anything like that for a very long time. I remember watching, and it's funny even thinking about this, but I remember I never had any interest, honestly, in the news or like politics. It always seemed kind of like alien to me, the whole process of it. But I remember being like 20, 21, 22, and I was at my brother's house, and I was like, at the time I was smoking like tons of weed constantly. And I also was just kind of like chilling. I didn't really have much of a job because I was just like selling weed and stuff at the time. So I had like a weird 20s where I kind of had all my time. Like I didn't have to go sit in a cubicle. I didn't have that experience of kind of like, I guess, being socialized professionally, which was something, I don't know if you ever talked to people who've like from young, from like 18 to like 40 have worked in an office, but it's like, it like really changes your mannerisms. It changes the way you speak and talk to people. And it for sure changes what you do and don't talk about. Even, I mean, it was almost like an absurd degree of like, people would talk about someone being drunk, and even that has to be euphemized. Like, oh, he had a couple, you can't just come out like, yeah, he was fucking hammered. It's like, well, yeah, he's a little tipsy, So I don't know. That was something that always freaked me out. But I remember I'm sitting on my brother's couch, and I'm like, the TV comes on and it's the news, and I'm like watching the news, and I'm just super stoned. And I remember watching it and being like, this is like the homeroom show from high school. I remember like it struck me as like that ridiculous, and the fact that it was like just some dude like being like in this thing, and it seemed like overly contrived and produced. And like ever since that one experience, I always just like look at it with that same kind of like, eh. And I've been inside of a news studio before. Then when you go inside of one, you're like, oh, this is like just weird cardboard cutouts, and you guys are, not all of them who do it, but the guys I met were kind of like, they kind of seemed like really dickish, and like, and I saw they had two modes too. Like I talked to them and the cameras would come on, and then it's like, boom, different person. And it was just kind of, the whole thing seemed strange to me.
Yeah, the plasticity, almost fakeness of it is very obvious. I think the mainstream media in particular, we could talk all day about that. People can go and listen to Matt and Shane's Secret podcast. I've listened to pretty much every episode. I've noticed over time you're becoming more spiritual. Would you say this is true, Matt? I feel like
Oh yeah.
there's a certain amount of spiritual growth that you've been putting your mind towards, right? Like this is something that you're actively seeking out, right?
Big time. Big time. And the last thing before I even get into that, the funny thing about the news is like, yeah, you realize it's like, these guys aren't just like coming up with these thoughts. This is a scripted program. It's agendized. Like they're writing it. They can't just like, the guy can't just be like, well, wait a second. It's like, you can't deviate from the script or, you'll get fired. So people should always think about that. But yeah, with the spiritual stuff, it was funny. I never really had I didn't really care for it. I grew up going to like Catholic church, hated it. And I was like, this is boring. This sucks. It's like restrictive, and it's, very dogmatic. And I didn't like it at all. So it kind of like it put a really bad taste in my mouth for like any kind of thing like that. But I was also in the position where like, I wasn't really, I don't like hate science. I think it brought a lot of cool stuff, but I wasn't really interested in that very much. Studying psychology. And that was the thing that originally turned me off to doing it, was like, So I thought, I was like, yeah, I can't wait to just like talk to people and do all that stuff. And like, no, you got to like construct studies. And you have to like, learn all the statistics. And I'm like, I don't want to do all that. So the spirituality stuff came weirdly from doing the Psych podcast, which was like, me just like reading different, just kind of researching different psychological modalities and kind of breaking them down and re-explaining them in a way that I would think would be like easy to understand, and kind of stripping away all the scientific, as much of the scientific jargon as I could, and like finding out what actually works for me, what doesn't, and kind of giving a more personalized account rather than like, in science, what's known as maintaining the objective view. Human beings have like tricked themselves into thinking they can be utterly objective, which is funny. But yeah, so it came out of when I was doing when we were talking about the ACT stuff, acceptance and commitment therapy. And I'm like researching and all this stuff. And this came from like I would like try to read about Buddhism, and it would just like, to me, it would just come off as these weird paradoxical riddles. And I'd be like, all right, enough of this. I never got anything out of it. So I did the acceptance and commitment therapy one. And that kind of really almost manualized this approach to like, and I think one of the most important things would, it manualized the approach to gaining what's called psychological flexibility. And psychological flexibility is, in a nutshell, it's just the ability to realize that you are thinking, and you are not like, your thoughts aren't like the God-given truth. They're just something floating through your mind, and especially about like self judgments, and how you perceive yourself, and how you perceive like what others are doing. Like that's just a thought, and it's being able to kind of distance yourself from like, to recognize that you were thinking. So to recognize your thought as a process rather than a content. So it's, you're sitting there, you go, oh, I'm a fucking loser. You can either take that as a thought that occurred to you, like I'm thinking that I'm a loser, or you can say, no, I'm a loser. Like I'm right, I'm correct. So yeah, so this, and it's going to be a long explanation, but this is kind of the kind of path I meandered down. So I started doing this psychological flexibility stuff, and so you start, part of it, there's like 6 processes. There's like there's presence, there's acceptance is one of them, like accepting, yourself, your situation as much as possible. There's working on being present, which is just like being kind of where you are rather than mentally appraising everything around yourself all the time. There's cognitive, what is it called? Cognitive diffusion, which is really just mindfulness of like, understanding that you're thinking and you're not your thoughts, and blah, 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 blah. What else? There's values, like cultivating what's actually important to you, and then committed action. The whole point is that you're supposed to like have thoughts, have feelings, have memories pop up inside of yourself. And rather than just kind of like giving into them and letting like, like the fear of like, oh, everyone's going to think I'm a loser at this party, therefore I'm going to like get hammered and do all this stuff. You're, rather than trying to avoid discomfort, you're then serving your values instead. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
So
Yeah,
like,
I think it's important to step outside of the process of thought, because you're so quick to get dragged downstream by this river of emotions and thoughts that it really takes like the ability to swim and look and see where the current is heading before you get dragged away with it. Would you
yeah,
agree with that?
that's exactly it. But and this is the thing. It's like before you become conscious of the fact that your thoughts are just thoughts, your feeling states are just feeling states, and that they have a fleeting and impermanent basis. Meaning, like if you say you feel anxious, if you just like let your body, if you accept the fact that you feel anxious, it'll just kind of pass naturally. If you start going, I'm anxious. Why am I anxious? Oh, I don't want to feel this way. You're just making it worse. It's like one of those self-feedback loops. Then people will start doing like, well, I felt anxious at the mall, so I'm just not going to the mall anymore. And, you start kind of cutting yourself off from all these things until you kind of end up in this kind of like self-constructed hamster cage of like you seeking a constant comfort, which is you just kind of, all you're doing is thinking of threats constantly, which is, kind of activating your nervous system. This is purporting like, rather than spending your life trying to constantly avoid perceived discomforts, of just figuring out what's important to you, acknowledging that there will always be pain and discomforts, and then just pursuing what's important to you. And over time, those discomforts start to kind of melt away. That's not the goal. You're not saying like, I don't ever want to be uncomfortable again. You're saying, look, I am going to be uncomfortable. I'm going to be anxious. I'm going to feel self-critical. I'm going to suffer the judgments of others. That's going to happen to me no matter what. So let me just kind of move in the path that like I feel like is calling me. If I had to just kind of wipe my slate clean and say like, well, what would you do if all that stuff was gone? It's like, well, I would do X, Y, and Z. It's like, well, go do X, Y, and Z. And then when the stuff pops up, that's where the mindfulness and all that other stuff comes up to be like, all right, I feel wildly uncomfortable. My heart's leaping out of my chest. But here's the thing I want to do. So I'm at least going to try to do that. And, and then that stuff starts to subside. So that, and then, you do all that and it's like, oh, a lot of this stuff just comes from like, Buddhist practices and all these other things. So I did the acceptance and commitment therapy one. That was like, I was just like being hit with skills that I was like, dude, what the fuck? Why don't they teach us in school? This is super helpful. And, so then at the time I knew there was like a connection with Buddhism. So I start kind of trying to read about that and all this other stuff. And then there was the book that really kind of, I think, put it in the perspective that kind of started pushing it more from me being psychological concepts for mental health and blah, 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 blah and mental well-being. That's a scientific paradigm of happiness. Honestly, I think psychology is like science's attempt at spirituality, if that makes sense. It hits on all the principles, but it kind of bleaches them with, yeah, it's just for this, materialist plane. And we're going to make you happy here because there's nothing else. And, blah, blah, blah. But then I read this other book, The Untethered Soul. It's like Journey Beyond the Self. I forget what it's called, but it's called The Untethered Soul and, colon some other words. So then I read that book and it took all of the stuff in acceptance and commitment therapy, but put it in a more like, I don't know what the word would be, like not folksy, but it put it more in like a spiritual, intuitive sense and kind of stripped it. You didn't need all the science, all the studies. You're constantly, when you're doing the science stuff, and there's been thousands of studies and the studies have been replicated and they're still here. And this was like, approach that stuff from what intuitively feels right. And it broke down the same exact ideas in a way that I was like, oh my God, this is so much more digestible. In the one part of the book, they have a whole segment of how you're not, how do you put this? Like that whole like are you familiar with the whole inner witness kind of thing of mindfulness? Like you're not like this was like, I think from Ramana Maharshi, it's the whole question, like, who am I? It's like, well, they go through it step by step. They're like, I'm my name, I'm Matt McCusker. And then, someone writes your name on a piece of paper and says, is this you? And you're like, well, no, that's not me. That's my name on a piece of paper. And it's like, and they're like, all right. So then it goes through step by step. It's like, well, I am, the thing that's, I'm Matt McCusker. Here's my story. Here's everything that's ever happened to me. And they're like, all right, they are the things that happen to you, but that's not you. And you say, all right. Well, I'm this, I'm a body, I'm a physical body. And it's like, well, like were you when you were 6? Because that was a different physical body than you have currently. And like, who was the you that was looking in the mirror at 6 years old? Is that person still looking in the mirror? And it goes through all of these things and eventually strips everything away to where you are just a conscious awareness, and all of this other stuff accumulates around your conscious awareness. And it's like, that was one of the moments, all the mindfulness, all the meditation stuff. I was like, oh, that's the point of meditation, to kind of get into that state where there's things happening. You're nervous, you're afraid, you're bugging out. You've ate an edible and you're bugging out. You can either be like, oh my God, I'm dying, or be watching it, witnessing the fact that, this entity that you're in, which, obviously I guess this is where like your family starts being like, what the fuck? You're just witnessing this experience and you're going, oh. And then when you take this more like larger transcendental witness mode to your experience, rather than being caught up in the swirl of it, it alleviates a ton of the anxiety. And that's where it clicked for me. I'm like, oh, this stuff has like a ton of, like, when you go back into the science mode, it has a ton of clinical benefit, and to like be able to believe all of this stuff. And the more you believe it, the more powerful it becomes. And at the time I was also doing these things that, it's just cannabis meditation. I was calling them deep dives, where I'd eat like a moderate to high dose edible, for me personally, I guess I should say, enough that would make me anxious, that would make me kind of be on the verge of a panic attack. And I used to suffer from anxiety like wickedly. And I would force myself into this state, but I would put on some meditation music and just lay there and meditate through it. And I was having these kind of like profoundly religious experiences, and I wasn't even really looking for that, but it was happening. And then I started using that kind of religious thinking and kind of belief in, a larger, like say like a governing, like God, basically like a governing force over the universe. And then going into those experiences I'd normally be anxious in, but equipped with that like belief in that I'm okay and taken care of in that capacity. And dude, it was like just shredding anxiety. And like, it was just like, that was a pretty cool experience. So, I know I just said a lot, but that was kind of like,
Matt, I will say that resonates with me so much, because growing up in Connecticut, Catholic upraising, I experienced a very similar thing, like this disassociation with the real. Like, if this is what's real, this pony show, this old man in a silly robe going, whoa, like this is not, religion. It just didn't feel right. And then I smoked cannabis and I went deeper and deeper. And what blossomed out of that experience, like you're describing, was, for me, very personally, an intuition, an intuitive sense to look for something other. Because at that time I was like, an atheist. I wanted to be a UFC fighter, you know, like I
Nice.
was into like this really kind of war-like mindset. You know, I'm 6'8". I was the captain of my wrestling team. So I almost could have been a UFC fighter. I'm not that strong. I'm pretty fucking skinny. I might have been like the on
6'8"?
Struve. Yeah, 6'8".
Jeez, bro. You were wrestling people?
Yeah, headlocks, and I would do the cradle. That was my move. Get someone in a cradle and flip
Oh.
them back. That was
Yeah, well,
my
your
move.
arms are the size of their legs, so yeah. It's like
This dude Rob Waller from Pennsylvania,
Mhm.
probably the first person I ever met from like rural Pennsylvania. He comes up to me and he goes, "This is at a wrestling camp, and these are big, tough wrestling
Yeah.
boys, you know." And Rob Waller looks at me, and goes, "I'm gonna call you High Pockets," and I'm like, "Hot Pockets? What the hell's Hot Pockets?" He's like, "High Pockets, because your pockets are off the ground so high." And I'm like, "What the hell?" But yeah, that's, you know, wrestling and being 6'8", they don't quite go together. I was always kind of an anomaly, a little bit of a black sheep.
Mhm.
But my point is, cannabis really blended with martial arts, because I was really apprehensive to smoke pot, because I was like, no, I'm a wrestler. I got to be good for my team and all this. But then I saw Eddie Bravo, you know, taking a bong hit, doing the twister. I find out Bruce Lee is eating cannabis in his training sessions, and I'm like, wow, like there is so much more to this plant. I interviewed Chris Bennett, who's written 5 or 6 books on cannabis, and he
Mhm.
studied the history of cannabis. It's gone back so far. I mean, I'm not sure how familiar you are with this, but they found cannabis resin on an altar in Jerusalem going back to the biblical times. And something that Chris Bennett has done is he's reinterpreted some of the biblical parallels and different phrases in the Bible to reveal that they might very well have been using cannabis as this kind of psionic oil that they described that was supposedly healing those with epilepsy. We know cannabis
Mhm.
helps people with epilepsy. I mean, this is the kind of thing that would have given Jesus the power to heal the sick from possession, right? This ability to give someone an oil that they didn't understand and heal them. But I mean, knowing what you know now, maybe you didn't know that until now, but how do you feel about like this spiritual journey? Because I know you're taking mushrooms, you're smoking pot, you're obviously taking cannabis in a very motivated and intentional way, right? I think a
Mhm.
lot of people just smoke pot like, woo, fun. But like
Yeah.
when you take that step to put an intention in anything you do, it has power. So when you multiply that with this sacred plant that's literally built for our endocannabinoid system, I mean,
Mhm.
is this, I mean, maybe I'm going off on my soapbox here, but is this something you
No,
agree
man. I
with?
mean, dude, and that it's like because I started smoking weed when I was very young, and well, I guess 14, so which I guess is young, but I remember doing it and I loved it and it was awesome. And then it like, I just started, I started smoking it, I started selling it, all this shit. And I was just like weed was like literally was my life for a very long time. Like it was all I thought about. It was all I was around. So I have a weird relationship, not weird, but I have a very, like I have a different relationship with it than I think a lot of people do. But I'm saying like it's better, it's superior. It's just, I've been around it for a long time. And, so I started like, and I started getting I would smoke it, I would do it. And like, I started like just getting anxiety all the time from it. And I'd have like, a two-pole thing where it was like, sometimes it would be like exactly what I was looking for. Other times it would just like freak me out and make me feel like everything was wrong and bad and blah, 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 blah. And there was something and again, this is where like the kind of more like intuitive spiritual mode kind of comes into being. But there would be like something I would do it. I would eat an edible, I would smoke it, and I would feel kind of wrong. And there'd be something telling me like, dude, this would be awesome if you did this. Like, if you could schedule it, like get out of impulsively using it and schedule it, and then just like do it and then just meditate. And I had it's just, it's a thought that occurred to me, and it just seemed like that would be awesome. And I'm like, I don't know if I could do that though. And, and it's still to this day, it's like a challenge of like kind of like separating. And again, I don't think there's anything wrong with like smoking weed, going to the movies, having fun, like go, like by all means, it's awesome. Go do that. But it wasn't until I incorporated that into like a meditation practice that I became like, oh, like this isn't just like, Cheech and Chong fun time. Let's smoke weed and watch Pokemon. Like this is really powerful if you, like you were saying, if you use it with intention and with the right, in the right context, and specifically with intention, like there's problems as you get older, you start being confronted with problems that seem impossible. You start saying, I genuinely, I don't have the capacity to figure this out. I like deep relationship issues. And that's when I started being like, all right, I'm at my personal wit's end. I don't know what's going on. I don't know what's what. I hear there's a voice in me. I can list all the things wrong with the other person, and I could do that forever. But it's like, let me try to take like an honest inventory, and you set the intention, you ingest it however you want to, forever, whatever intensity or whatever you want. And then you just meditate. And it was like, I noticed when I did that, it would just bring up, like, it would point me to little things that I was doing. Kind of, again, it just like lowers your defenses a little bit. And you go, yeah, I'm okay. That's where I'm being a little weird, And again, it's like, it's not like because I just did the 5 grams of mushrooms. That's like an ego wipeout. It's just, not, doesn't last forever, but it just pulls the curtain aside. And you go, oh my God, that's what I'm up to. And you're like, and then, eventually it starts, obviously it rebuilds itself. But I think cannabis is good because it's like, you can do these like meditations on it, dude, by like 3 hours later, you're ready to roll. Like, not even like you could roll during it really, but like as soon as it subsides, you're good. Like you can go off, you can go do whatever you want. Like you're not like, I was spaced out for like 3 fucking days after I did the 5 grams of mushrooms, but not even in a bad way. So yeah, it's like, again, it's just, there's a whole thing surrounding this kind of discussion where people start going, oh yeah, blah, 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 blah. And it's like, whatever, that's fine and that's fun. But like for me personally, if I'm being honest, it like approaching cannabis with like kind of like a more mindful intention has been something that I would say like transformed my life for the better. And just kind of like, it didn't do it all at once, but it kind of just reorients your path and kind of like, hey, try this, and then try this and try this. And it kind of takes you away from the whole like, mindlessly appeasing your own ego, which, again, it's never enough. You like, and I've experienced this of being like, oh, it'd be cool if I had that. And then you get that and you go, no, my life kind of still sucks. If I had that, and then I'll hit a point where you're like, you know what, man, I think I'm just like deeply, deeply frustrated, and it like I have to become okay with myself, and that's a whole other thing. But so yeah, so that was kind of that's the like you were saying, that's the tangible aspect of spirituality, and that's what I think these plants do. It's like I could show up to church with my parents and sit there, and I equate it to like like a Roman Catholic Church versus like having a mystical experience with a plant or with other people or meditation chanting, whatever you got to do, because there's other options to do it. I feel like it's like the difference between owning stock in Pepsi versus drinking Pepsi. So it's like sure, you can approach it in this weird kind of hedging your bets way, or you can like experience that kind of religious ecstasy that people have been doing for thousands of years. But it's like we're so blocked from it. It's weird, it's psychotic, it's delusional, it's this and that. And then you do it and you go, this actually works. I mean, science even shows that having some form of religious practice extends your lifespan. It has like real benefits. It's like, well, it's not real. It's like, well, the benefits are real. So, you
Well,
know,
and to your point, I think we're starting to, maybe I'm very self-absorbed in this podcast community where people are thinking thoughts like this often, but it feels really like we're experiencing a shift towards people being more aware of the subtleties of conscious. I mean, something you touched on previously was like the difference between objective reality and subjective experience. And I think where a religion and spirituality kind of differ for me is like religion wants you to get on board with this predetermined objective reality, whereas real spirituality always tells you to go inward into your subjective experience to find the answers. Internally is where you find those answers, not externally, right? Because when we pray and when we meditate, we're going inward. We're touching on this connection. And this is maybe just my own personal belief, but I have always taken solace in the fact that there is a higher version of my consciousness, right?
mm,
So like we touched on before with the ego and the watcher and the witness of consciousness, we have an unconscious self, a subconscious self, and a superconscious self, right? And in between, that makes up our consciousness, right? So there's really kind of 3 parts. They make up a 4th part. And to me, I think when we connect with our higher self, which is that kind of consciousness that exists outside of time, is in that same mode of consciousness when we're really stoned sometimes, right?
mm,
And if you set the intention to do that, you can do that. But it's not just going to work like magic. If you go and watch Pokemon and smoke pot, you might not have that. But if you put a methodology behind the kind of your motivations, it's not about being regimented, but it's about being able to, like we said previously, get yourself out of that flowing current and look up, see where you're heading, and start to steer yourself in the direction you want to go. Because, you know, past, present, future, you're not in the present. You're not in the present if you're thinking about the past. You're not in the present if you're thinking about the future. You know, when we're in the future, we're having anxiety. When we're in the past, we're having depression or regret or shame. So
Mhm.
being in the moment is all you'll ever really experience. So let's understand where we're at, right? And
Yeah,
I
and dude,
think that's it.
no, absolutely, man. And that's one of those challenges too, because like a lot of times you just bring, like you were saying, you just bring baggage that just does, like, say, like I'm sitting in a chair, like right now I'm sitting in a chair, and I'm like sitting here trying to like write something. I can start thinking about 9 million different things, and then start to physically experience these things that aren't here. It's like, I'm worried about, like, is this thing suck, or what do I got to do today, or I have plans for 2 weeks, and I don't know, like, is there going to be some weird social function I have to go to? I might be uncomfortable in. But then like you're saying, the present moment is going, what are you doing right now? Well, I'm sitting in a chair and I'm writing something. It's like, well, then just do that. Like, you're putting your body like daily through all of this extra stress that's not even here right now, which is probably only going to make the actual stressful event worse because you've been thinking about it and, like fantasizing about it. So it's like, yeah, dude, it's a humongous skill to start to develop, just that alone. And to do the mindfulness bell, I have it on my phone. That's been one of the best things I've ever done. I have it. I think it's just called the mindfulness bell app. It's free. And you can set it to go off as many times as you want. And you'll be sitting there and it goes bing. And all of a sudden you go, again, you set an intention behind it. You say, as soon as this thing goes off, I'm going to physically release all the tension in my body, which is, you start to accumulate like just all the time. Release that, take an inventory of what I'm doing, how I'm feeling, and if the thing I'm doing fits into my larger scheme in terms of like what I genuinely want to do with myself or not. And you confront that over and over and over and over. It's pretty cool. But again, a lot of this stuff gets kind of like shoot off because it takes people to a place that is very uncomfortable to go. It's like I could have ignored all of this stuff. I could have ignored all the, let's say, the intuitional communication that has been occurring since I've been young, be like, going into an office and being like, this is fucked up. Like, you shouldn't be stuck inside in a cubicle all day. This is fucked. This is a fucked up dynamic. And, if you go in there and say that, the whole context you're in is going to go, you're wrong. You're fucked up. And it's like, I mean, obviously I think I am on some level, but I know for a fact you can't trap people in cubicles for 40 years and just bake them under fluorescent lights and give them like bullshit non-work. It just seemed just bizarre. So, so it's like being in touch with that part of yourself and like, there's something in you that's kind of beckoning you towards a more genuine existence and you can ignore it, but it's only at your own peril. And like a lot of time goes by of you ignoring that, it gets harder and harder to confront because then you start thinking of all the wasted time. And, it's like, and there's also stuff too, like say the fact that like you think that might be the case. It's not like a world ending thing or like, oh my God, I ruined it's not like that. I don't want to paint it like that, but it's like, just learning how to slowly go back and forth between like intuitively realizing, cause I could do the same thing where I'd like started thinking everything's wrong. And then, then you don't participate in anything and that's not a good thing at all. So it is a balance, but just really learning how to listen to yourself intuitively and how like, it's a big deal. I do this too. You approach life like, whatever. But it's like, no, what you choose to do and don't do is a tremendously big deal. And, it should be approached that way rather than kind of just letting people talk you through it and just following, like, oh, I guess these are the paths I do. I go to college, I do this, I get married, and I can just go through the motions. But like you said, there's that witness inside of you that's going like, this doesn't feel real or like doesn't feel like 3-dimensional. It feels
And
like,
our culture tells us to tell that witness to shut the hell up because, it's no measure of health to be well adjusted to a profoundly sick society. Some great man whose name is hard to pronounce because he's from India said that.
mm,
And the truth is that our society is not geared towards making us healthy, happy human beings. It's geared towards making us Fortean type, slave minds who just plug into the system and act and function as a cog in the wheel. And, now they've gotten to the point where since we're not happy being cogs in the wheel, they have to go and play all these mind games on us and turn us against each other and I give us identity groups to fall into. And then that creates a bunch of problems that we
mm,
then fight over. And everybody's just looking for a sense of meaning in life. Because that's all
yeah,
that is. When you attach yourself to one group or another, you're just trying to fit in, So ultimately, the true renegade thing to do. The true way to overcome is not by grouping up with other people, but it's going inwards and being the example, living the example that you think others should look up to, right? Because you
Mhm.
can only change yourself. I mean, I had Taoist monk David Way on the podcast, and I asked him, I said, David, how do you help the people around you? You know, like, what do you tell your family when they're sick? And he's like, I don't, man. I don't tell them. They just see me do what I do. And if they have questions, I answer them. But I'm not going to try to tell them how to live their life. You know, and he told me three things to live by: move, massage, meditate. And I think once you really understand that, like, we're moving, we're not perfect, we're soft. Sometimes we need a nice little massage and
Mhm.
meditate, you know, because it's just, and I'm probably repeating that every episode since I interviewed him: move,
It's good.
massage,
It's good to
meditate.
repeat. Yeah.
But it's, you know, I wanted you to hear that, Matt. I think you could understand that. And yeah, man, I'm really into what podcasting has done for me as far as connecting me to more people that are like-minded. And that's not to create some kind of echo chamber, but it
Sure.
can be kind of daunting to be like feeling like, oh wow, I don't have anybody to talk about this stuff with. So I have to ask you, Matt, like, do you generally feel like this is something that you have people to relate it with, like, you know, going inward and this journey
Yeah,
you've taken?
for a long time I didn't, and I want to talk about the stuff you were talking about before too, before I forget. But to answer your question, it's like, yeah, dude, this is what, and this is where I think personally, again, if other people like other means for this, that's fine. For me personally, the psychedelic stuff is cool because it's like, they're going to do it now where, and I think this is a good thing too, ultimately, of like, it's going to be just another arm of science, and you go in, there's a doctor, and you do it. I think with psychedelics, you can also do a thing where it's like with your family. It's like, I did it with my brother. My brother did it. I knew my brother wanted to do it, and I got him a guided session, and then he did it. And he was like, yo, you got to try that. That's awesome. Like, blindfold 5 grams, play some music, however you want to do it, just try to turn it into a meditative intention exercise. And I was so fucking nervous, dude. I didn't want to do it. I was putting it off about, then I was like, fuck it. I set a date. But to answer your question, it's like, me and my brother both did this thing, and it's different. I did it when I was like 19, I was, oh, I did it. It's like way different when you're 35, dude. So we both did it, and it kind of stripped, there was like so much defenses between us, and, like, not even in a bad way. It was just, we both had our own little defenses. There's certain things we wouldn't talk about. And now, like, that just, like, we just talk about anything now. So like, I'll just, and like that kind of creates like what you're talking about. Like, you don't have to be so alienated. You can kind of like, if you start to even get one person who you would communicate this with. And again, this all comes back to like the best prescription for all of it is just being as honest as possible. Because you don't have to be right. Everyone's trying to be right, but it's like, yeah, good luck with that. But you can be as honest as you want. So it's like, now, like, I have one person I talk to. I have, my other friend, Andrew Spud. I can talk to Andrew about anything. And then you start going, I can talk to anyone about this shit. If they're not into it, that's not really my issue. And obviously I'm not going to like, corner them like, kind of my uncles do to me with sports, where it's like, I'm genuinely not interested in what's going on with like the, Cleveland Browns at any given moment, but they'll like, or whoever, whatever sports team, and they'll corner me. And I just, I kind of like nod along, and I'm like, okay, man, like, that's cool. I'm not even being like, oh, you can't believe you like this. It's just, it's like, I'm glad you guys enjoy this. It's pretty cool. They even said like sports is kind of like one of the kind of spiritual practices of our times, is it's something people can actually bond over and watch, and like it's an organization outside of yourself. So I don't want to like snark on that. I think it's cool. I just, for me, I don't really care who
Hey,
wins.
I'm with you, man. I am not a sports fan. Maybe I gave you the wrong impression when I said I was a wrestler, but yeah, my family thinks some crazy podcast has a hard, fast rule: no sports talk. Okay.
But yeah, it's like, it's, I can sit here and talk about this stuff to some of my uncles who love sports, and I'm just going to glaze their eyes over, and I'm not going to be like, hey, that's cool, man. We all love each other, and that's fine. But it's like recognizing that's a thing. It doesn't mean they're bad or you're bad. It's just things resonate with people on different levels. Um,
Yes.
but so the other thing, talking about like you were saying earlier. So yeah, to answer your question, it's like, yeah, just be honest with people. And it's, some people are not going to get it. People are going to laugh at you. They'll do this, but you'll be surprised, because that, this, I feel like people who can become into this stuff kind of go through things where like they kind of hit a hard wall. So it's like, if people haven't hit that wall, good for them, man. I don't want to like force this down their throats. I personally have hit it multiple times. So, but in terms of like you were saying, like, we're not really this, a lot of the parts of society aren't really set up for this kind of inquiry or this kind of like, as honest and open discussion. A lot of it gets kiboshed. And like you were saying with the political stuff, it's like, you're like, well, I'm on this group, so therefore I don't like this group. And dude, if I go and talk to like, say, like I have family members who are super conservative and I start saying like, talking about like money and how money's just printed and they're going to be like, oh, you're a communist. If I go talk to friends of I known who are like super left and I'm like, dude, this is crazy, we're being like told what to do by the government, they're going to be like, you're a fucking right-wing conspiracy nut. And it's just like it's like, it doesn't matter. It's just very funny how like, they're just going to be like, you're that one, you're this one, blah, blah, blah. And as soon as you kind of say something against like the overarching, let's say, system, you're now the enemy of the other one. Because like, oh, you hate the system. They are all both convinced that both hate the system and like whatever.
And they want to stamp you on your forehead. They want to give you that stamp on the forehead because what that does is it gives them an excuse to not think further on your position. And like you're saying, that's not even really your position because you're able to go to one group and give an opposing position and another group and giving an opposing position. Obviously, there's no bias there if you're able to, entertain both thoughts and entertain both conversations. But it's disheartening sometimes to see that people aren't willing to come to the table to discuss certain things. They're just more likely to label you as a group, and that's the end of it sometimes, right? But maybe
the spirituality stuff, exactly. Spirituality stuff is like, the problem it goes from being like, what should the tax rate be to be like, I love both those guys, like I love them both, and I'm gonna accept both of them for who they are, and I'm just going to be honest with them, and that's like different than being like, I'm gonna wear a donkey hat or like wave a stick or whatever, or whatever the other one is, an elephant. So and then honestly too, like that whole, because I used to be on some like serious like fuck the government forever shit, and it's like I don't even think like that anymore. I just think like, again, I think people are just caught up in their own shit, and they just get like, and it happens to all of us, and we can be caught up in our own shit at any time. But there are people I feel like who don't think about this kind of stuff at all, and I think it does create kind of problems. But and if you look at like the current situation now, because we have the COVID stuff, everyone feels strongly about it one way or the other. That it's hard to be like, oh, whatever. It's it's pretty jarring. Like we've had mandates, we have masks in different area and all this stuff, and again, it's like you can fall into the thing like, well, fuck all that. It's bullshit. And it's like, well, there are people who did die of it, and there are people who are genuinely afraid of it, so that you can approach it like that, where it's like, I'm not being dominated by the government. I just want people to be comfortable. But then you can also say like, all right, man, well, I also don't want to live in a world where I have to like estimate the meters between me and another person. That's kind of fucking weird. Like, I don't, so, it is, there's a ton of like variables going on with it. But like the thing that really cracks me up, and I kind of noticed this today when I was out on a walk, you start to pay, because right now we're being convinced that like the government loves us and just wants us to like take this medicine they've made and all this stuff, and if you say anything negative or even like saying like maybe I'll wait kind of stuff, with the vaccine, it's like, do you take it, do you not? And to even suggest like, yeah, I'm going to hold off, I don't fully trust these companies who are putting this out, I can go through a list of all this fucked up shit they did. But like, to even bring that up, you're again, like you're saying, boom, stamped, conspiracy nut, fucking psycho. But if you look at like the larger picture, when you're walking around, you start thinking like, okay, what's okay to do without a mask and what's not? And it's like, can I go to church? Like, well, no, mask on for church. And again, there's a lot of people there, but whatever, mask on for church. Even if, so there's that, like, can I see my family? In the beginning, they're like, no, you can't see your family. But we've been able to eat outside without a mask the entire time in a restaurant. And they say, well, that's supporting the economy. It's like, okay, I want the economy to be good, but it's also like, you see a pattern, you're like, oh, I can take it off if I'm serving the dollar in some way. And you start going like, that's kind of interesting. What else can I do?
A good little boy.
Yeah.
As long as you're a good little boy,
I might be overanalyzing this, or I might be biased, but it's like, okay, so I can't go outside without a mask and take a walk for my own mental health and well-being, but I can eat a bagel. And that's like, as scary as this is, I can eat a bagel as long as I pay money for a bagel. If I want to go like see my fucking parents and talk to them or see my whole family, I'm now an enemy of the state, but I can eat a bagel with a bunch of strangers who are also eating bagels. And you start going, what the fuck? But these people have my best intentions. And that's what I'm saying. If it's purely a best intention thing, then it's like, then let people all speak their mind on it. And it's like, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it's like, no, for real, dude. Like, this works. We want you all to be safe. It's like, that's hard to accomplish when you're like shutting people down or labeling people. Cause that goes into like, there's a guy, Richard Dawkins. Is it Richard Dawkins? David Dawkins. He talks about I always fuck his name up. I think it's David Dawkins, but he starts talking about this idea of power versus force. And what they're using a lot of times is force. They're saying like, oh, you're going to talk about this, bam, you're fucking kicked off of this, you're kicked off of that platform. That's force, because they're not like using like understanding would be a sense of power. Like if you use force, you're creating a counter force. So like say you say, hey man, fuck this, I'm not getting this thing, and I say you're a fucking weirdo and a loser. I've now created a counter force where I've tried to, like, rather than understanding you, which would be like a sense of power, being like, all right, I'm okay with myself, let's hear your truth. I'm going to come from you at a place of understanding. Now I actually heard you out, and I can say, oh, I hear what you're saying. Check this out. And I can honestly say how I feel about something that you said. And then now we're kind of like, maybe moving together a little bit. But if you use force, then all you're doing is creating counterforce. Oh, mass, no mass, you're a loser. You're wearing a mask, you're a pussy. You're just creating animosity, more and more animosity, until a bubble forms and then it pops. So that's something I've been thinking about a lot. And again, that comes from a more spiritual perspective. So
Right. And I would push it a step further, and maybe into uncomfortable waters for you. But personally, I'm not afraid because I have the faith in the sense of soul and self that even if I die of a virus in a hospital bed, I'm going to come back, and I can't say that everybody needs to believe that, but I personally believe that I will reincarnate and that my soul is much more than just this body that I'm in right now. So I think a lot of the campaign of fear that people are experiencing hinges on the fact that they mortgage the scarcity of life, or they leverage the scarcity of life against death, right? They give you this impending sense of death and then make you feel like, well, life is so limited. If I don't make these choices really the right way, then I could lose it all. And that's that impending sense of doom that I think a lot of people are, their common sense and their logic is falling victim to that, because we, as you know human beings, we have these instincts to defend ourselves and protect ourselves, and slowly over time, and again, this is my opinion,
well, I dig it, for the record,
but over time they've indoctrinated us to be in this kind of, well, I'll do what you tell me kind of mindset, because it's easier that way. And people have so much stress to just put food on the table that if you ask them to do a math problem or locate, Papua New Guinea on a map, they're like, what the fuck are you talking about? Like, I got to put food on my table, So there's a certain amount of mental work that getting out of the matrix requires. And I think that is the inherent benefit that the matrix has, is it's really good at trapping people inside of it once it's created, and I'm not a Chicken Little sky is falling type person. I think we all came here to do this, to take on this challenge. Yeah, there's going to be evil people. Yeah, there's going to be fucked up people. Yeah, there's going to be people that are going to break your heart, but you signed up for it. You signed up for the lesson to learn and become stronger from it. And ultimately, it reminds me of something my mentor taught me when I decided to drop out of college. It's like, you are who you say you are, like he came into my life in such a strange way. This homeless indigenous man from Arizona hanging out on the Yale University campus. I was just a college student at Gateway, not even Yale, and he changed my life by teaching me these things about indigenous culture and praying, and that connected me, right? And I think a lot of people unfortunately get so dragged into the current, they don't have a mentor or an opportunity for a mentor to kind of shake them up and be like, no man, this is what the real world is, and because I was in that state of like, yeah, Catholicism is bullshit and weed is really cool, like what else is there? It hit me at this perfect time, and maybe that makes me a different person, and masks and COVID, and I just don't care. Like I don't wear a mask unless I have to, because I'm not trying to be an asshole, like I want to be able to buy groceries and not make a scene. But it's like you gotta stand up for yourself too. And I think that what David Way, the Taoist I interviewed, taught me is like, you got to lead by example. And what you just said is beautiful. Be powerful, not forceful. And that's exactly what he was kind of telling me too. It's like, be powerful, don't be forceful. Understand where people are coming from, so you can then give them the benefit of your understanding rather than discounting them and trying to just force your understanding on them,
Yep.
because we're all signing up for this. We all signed up for this crazy third dimensional reality experience, but I mean, we're kind of coming towards the close here, Matt. What are your final thoughts? Anything you want to leave with our
Yeah.
audience?
I mean, dude, I agree with pretty much everything you're saying. And again, like, just think about the fact that it's like, oh, what am I going to die? Well, I'm not afraid to die. And again, it's like, I am genuinely like, I don't want to right now. I'd be upset. But I also, like you were saying, I approach it more like I have faith in the fact that I'll be okay. And it's like, I ultimately know that even if I do get sick, like you were saying, I think I'll be okay. And if I'm not okay, then, that's just out of my hands. And it becomes a question of like, do you want to preserve life at the cost of everything that makes it worth living? It's like, do I want to like live in a bubble forever so that I don't die? It's like, well, no. So it's like, well, it's just for a year. Okay. Well, say it was for 4 years. Like at what time period would you say this is too much for, the risk of not dying or getting sick? Is one like, will you trade a year of your life? Like, yeah, I'll trade how about 5? It's like, no, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So it becomes a point where it's like, who's to say how much time is acceptable to sacrifice and living in the bubble wrap mode? That should be a conversation.
COVID is
So
like the vacation we all got stranded on. Like, this is fun. Like, we could do this. And then it's like, no, like, why don't we get, like, what, Dad, get the rental car already. We need to go home. Like,
yeah. No, absolutely. So yeah, I mean, to close it out, yeah, it's like, just I'm really interested always in kind of like finding little kind of ways to take the more rational minded people and just try to like open them up to the fact of like there's, again, the book is called Power versus Force. It's pretty good. They spend a lot of time talking about applied kinesiology, which is a whole other subject, which I don't really care about that much. But they start talking about the invisible universe. And in terms of the power versus force model, it's like, there's things that we didn't know existed that just exert their power, like gravity. Gravity was around, it was keeping us tight, held to the planet. Gravity doesn't have to like exert itself. It's a complete entity. It's a power. It's something that, it's something that is in, what they call the invisible universe. Like, we discovered that, oh, okay, that's a thing. There's bacteria, germs, all this stuff. They were all previously part of an invisible universe. They were there, but they were outside of our perception. So I always tell people like, there's so many things that that we didn't know that we've discovered, and you just see them as like these like eternal forces that just emanate naturally in the universe. And then you can boil that down to the human level where it's like, this would be an example of it. Like, say you're in a relationship with someone and there's stuff they're doing that you kind of don't like. What can you do? You can scream at them. That's being forceful, and that's just going to create them to become kind of recalcitrant and kind of resistant. Or you can try to openly communicate with them from a place of love and say, hey, like, this is what this brings up in me when you do this. Hear them out, and then it's up to them if they want to not do that or not. And then rather than kind of like forcing your agenda on other people, you could practice the acceptance. Like, well, let me remove the desire from me for this person to act in a way that I don't like, because how much of this is just my own weird shit. So that was kind of a meander, but really it's like letting people acknowledge that, like, dude, there's so much more to the universe. Like, we laugh at people in medieval times. That was it was what, a couple hundred years ago, of their conception of the universe. To think that we all of a sudden nailed it now is just falling in line with all of the other people who thought they nailed it, who were all wildly wrong. So it's like, just be open to the fact that there's more stuff that exists outside of yourself. And the spiritual way of being is like, you hit a crossroad where you say, all right, I'm definitely alive. I'm definitely in a universe. Is the universe like, am I part of like some form of eternal and unchanging thing? Or is the universe basically this kind of indifferent and cold thing that doesn't care at all about life in any capacity? And you just choose to say, I choose to think it does, and it's like, and there's so many benefits to doing that versus being like, fuck that, I don't believe it. And then, you go with the scientific model, which is just predicated on doubting everything constantly, which works again for making medicines. It's awesome. But for the human mind, I think it starts to create a pretty shitty state and like a pretty meaningless state. So it's like, I just choose to live in the cooler version of it. And then, and I still like the scientific model. And it's like, well, I'll take both, dude. You can have both. That's what I'm saying. Like, you can have both. You can have the mental security of like just acknowledging the possibility that the universe is wildly more complex than you can conceive of, and that it ultimately cares about you on some level. And yeah, you just go with that. And there's, for me, again, from all like my mission with the Psych stuff was to bring people tools to increase their mental well-being. And it's like, here's one, and nobody talks about it. And it's like, it's a personal choice. It's funny that religion and spirituality now is a taboo, which is like, it's pretty funny. But yeah, so that's it, dude. That's pretty much it. Thanks for having me on here. I really like talking about this stuff. So
Matt McCusker, the pleasure's all mine. I mean, please, folks, if you haven't listened to Matt and Shane's Secret Podcast already, I don't know what the hell you're doing. And they have Gillian Keeves' new
Yeah, man.
YouTube channel with some really funny stuff on there. And I just realized you guys have some sick. I'm an audio listener only, so
Mhm.
I didn't realize how sick your YouTube intros were. Like when you watch Matt and Shane on YouTube, it's like a badass intro, and then you guys are there at the table.
Sean
So
Gardini. That's Sean Gardini helped us out with that big time. He's been
okay,
doing a lot of our stuff.
yeah,
He's a man.
he shout out to him. Shout
Funny
out to
dude
War
too.
Mode. I love your brother Billy and
Mhm.
Spud. They got a great podcast there. And then yeah, folks. I mean, please, like I said, check out Matt. I'm sure he might be on the road with Shane, so please go check out Shane's dates. And yeah, Matt, dude, this has been really fun, man. I appreciate having you, and thanks for listening to the My Family Thinks I'm Crazy podcast. Are we really the crazy ones?
Thanks, man.